Okay, so to create a procedural eye texture for this, simply select your sphere, create a material. You can do any fine tuning of the material later. First, Shift A and create a UV map node. Shift A, mapping node. Output UVs to vector and location. Also, so Shift A, and we want ramp, R-A-M-P, ramp. And it's a good idea while you're creating these things to assign a label to them if you want to label them according to specific things. Like if this one's going to be my iris pupil, for example, it's going to control that, be clear. And so for this first color ramp, I'm going to set it for constant. Just for now, could set it for something else later. Just depends. I'm going to duplicate it, Shift D. I'm going to set this one for linear. And this one I'm actually going to use to create the color that's going to appear within the eye. So white is going to be the majority of the eye there. Going to add a couple of more ramps. So I'm going to assign a few more colors. And let's do this one, I don't know, something unusual. We'll go for maybe a violet color. Something like violet, magenta, what else? We'll go for purple there. And we'll see how that works out. Okay, so let's say we're going to start there. Now, usually when you're making an eye material, a lot of the color is going to be towards the upper end of the value. So pupil's going to be around there. In the beginning of the iris and the end of the iris are usually going to be around here somewhere. Just depends on how much VI you want covered with the material or the procedural texture. So now I need these to respond to the mapping. And so you can just plug in vector into the FAC of each node. Okay, now we need these two to basically work together. So I'm going to Shift A and create Shift A, mix, and we want a mix color. Okay, and we want it to set for this case multiply. And I'm plugging the iris pupil color into B and the iris. Let me rename this top one here. We'll just call this one iris shade into A. And let's see what the result is right now. I'll feed that into my base color. And already we essentially have what we're working towards. Just needs a little cleanup. Okay, so once you have your iris shade set up, you can bring the colors in a little closer together on the ramp to tighten things up there on the eye, to make the iris a bit smaller or a bit bigger, depending on what you actually need. I'm going to make it about the same size as the iris on the blue eye right next to it. And let's say it's going to be right around there. Okay, now if you want to, you can play around with these later to make adjustments, to add additional colors, so you can give different gradations, and even to simulate somewhat of a transition in the lighting or even the visual depth of what you see on the eye. But that looks fairly solid to me. And of course, you can come in and play around with the gradients a bit more, make the pupil there or the lens of the eye look a bit more open. And of course, you have your little iris pupil shader here that you can use later to sort of simulate the opening and closing of the iris. Now, if you want an additional detail to the iris, then what you're going to need is you're going to need a few other nodes. First, you're going to need a wave texture node, a noise texture node, a multiply divide node, or sorry, say a multiply node, an add node. These are basically mixed color nodes with multiply and add settings on them. And you'll need a third multiply as well as an additional color ramp. So when you create your color ramp, you can just duplicate from an existing one, of course, rename it, give it a label so you can tell what it is. This is going to be your detail, iris detail, and multiply, add, multiply. You can also label those as well. Make sure you plug the mapping into the color ramp, as well as into both of your texture nodes. So output the vector to vector, vector to vector. Okay, and vector to back on your color ramp. And then feed the FAC. You can do the noise or the color depending on what you're looking for. Into A for noise and wave into, and usually I'll use the wave color into B. And then I'll feed that multiply divide node or multiply node out to the add node on A. Feed the color ramp or the color ramp into B. And then we can feed the add out to the new multiply node under A. And we take our existing multiply node, which is basically housing the color for the iris. We feed that into B, and then we feed the output from our newest multiply node into the base color. Until then we can see it's actually in the iris. Now we can come in here and we can play around with the colors to get everything to look more appealing, which means we come down here and we can expand things out a bit. Okay, and usually I will switch this over to linear so we can get more blending of colors instead of just being hard edges. So I'll set it for linear. I'm going to come in here tight, and we want the darkest area to be closest to the center. And then we can come in and create additional ramps to not only control where the edge of the influence of our incoming mask is, but we can also define the color and add additional colors into our iris. So already you can see that it looks much nicer than that flat color that was in there. And so we can come in and play around with the color that's being fed into it as well. So we're adding additional patterns in and additional shading to influence the output. And of course, we can bring that closer to the edge, make it sharper, softer. Okay. And as I said, we can add additional colors in to offset the aesthetic, depending on what we want to happen here. If we want it to be a bit brighter in the center, leave it a little darker. And of course, we can also play around with our textures to refine the output, to change the sort of way that the waves in the eye look, add a bit more distortion, add less distortion, make things a little darker, brighter. And of course, if you don't want to use color, you can switch it to FAC, and that'll also give you a completely different result when it feeds into the eye, changes the way the colors react. Now, usually I will use color with the noise, just because it gives me nice little extra speckles in the eye, and then I can play around a bit more to get additional effects just by switching the type as well.